My name is Timothy Brittain-Catlin, and I teach at the Kent School of Architecture at the University of Kent. And this is a talk about new ways of writing and talking about buildings, and also about why being a failure in architecture is not as bad as it sounds. Now, one of the features of modern architectural criticism is that it's extremely narrow. It tends to talk about buildings as if they were successes or failures or good or bad. There is more to a building than that, much more, and it's important that we talk about those other things if we want to communicate buildings to as wide an audience as possible, and in that way make more people more sensitive to what it is that architecture has to offer. Now, the idea that buildings are good or that they're bad, it's true, of course, but it's a tiny part of the story, and it only applies to a very small number of people. So the other thing that I want to do is to broaden the range of architectural criticism so that many more buildings become part of it and more people can read more into what they see in their everyday environment. The idea that buildings are good or that they are bad, that there is morality involved, is a very British one. It was invented in the 1830s by Augustus Pugin, who is widely known as the leader of the Gothic Revival and also the architect for most of the interiors of the Palace of Westminster. And what Pugin said in his books of that period and in the first few years of the reign of Queen Victoria were that the truth of a building was the most important thing. Let then the beautiful and the true be our watchword, is what he writes in 1841. And the people around him, the young, assertive, ambitious people of the Gothic Revival, adopted this language, and they adopted it in everything that they did. In fact, very quickly, the modern tradition of grotesque invective in the use of architectural criticism began to be born. The Ecclesiological Society, a band of supporters of the furnishing and decoration of English churches so that they looked the way they had done just before the Reformation in England, when they travelled around the country, they didn't say, that's a building we don't much like, or that's a good try, but it's not really quite there. What they said instead, when they came back and they wrote their articles about their trip in their journal, was, this is the most ridiculous and revolting building we have ever seen. Now, that temptation to be rude, very rude, about buildings has never really gone away. It still sits there in much modern criticism, and it's not very helpful. It was used particularly by supporters of the story that tells the birth of the modern movement from the late 19th century into the middle of the 20th, by people who wanted to point out which buildings supported the theory of modernism and which ones didn't. And if they did, they were good. And if they didn't, they were either terrible or they were not worth mentioning at all. Now, as it happens, I think that this business about the morality of buildings is a complete red herring from start to finish. I don't think that any architect in the 1840s, just like any architect today, would set about designing a building from the point of view of its morality or its romance or its piety or all these other types of concepts which are being introduced at this time. The reason why architects spoke like that in the 1840s was because they latched on to the language of the clients they wanted to attract, and they were the church leaders. This was the audience. These were the people who were going to build the new churches, the monasteries, the convents, the cathedrals, the church restorations, and all the rest of it. That's why they spoke like that. Because the truth is that architects are not very good at speaking about their own work. They are visceral people. They work with images. They work with their hands. They don't work with words. And of course, by definition, it's impossible to say why your building is important because the importance of it hasn't happened yet when you've designed it. So that's what they were doing. And in fact, there is a lot of evidence that when people in England, never a particularly intellectual country perhaps, talked about their buildings at that time, they actually, when they were talking between themselves, talked about the nuts and bolts of it. My colleague Henrik Schoenfeld, who teaches with me at the Kent School of Architecture, has been investigating recently the birth of the design of the Crystal Palace, that fantastic monument, which is talked about now in grand conceptual terms. But at the time, it's precisely the nuts and bolts. It's the airflow, it's the sunlight. Those are the things that the people were talking about. So this business of the morality lying behind the birth of modern architecture, 20th century architecture, high-tech architecture, all those things seems to me to be entirely misplaced. Now, I want to give you an example of why conventional ways of talking about buildings are inadequate. When you go into work in the morning, you'll pass a large number of buildings that nobody has ever written about and probably never will. It seems to me that if architectural criticism is to have any value to it, it must be capable of talking about the buildings that we see all the time. That's the only way, really, to bring them in to the circle of criticism and also to bring them out to everybody who can appreciate from them. A very good example can be found in the typical English high street. The type of buildings that you see in the average high street, the bank, the post office and so on, are not buildings that by and large get much talked about, and yet they're buildings that many people see every day and certainly saw closely in the days when shopping was done in the high street by walking from one building to the next. Now, the high street changed very dramatically in England from about the beginning of the 20th century, and one of the reasons behind that change is what happened to the banks. Banks in England had been designed as commercial premises. They just looked like office blocks. They looked like late Victorian offices. There was nothing particularly bank-like about them until the early years of the 20th century, when Horace Field, a Hampstead architect who worked for Lloyds Bank, started to design bank branches in everyday high streets that looked like the warm and comfortable buildings or houses of merchants of, say, the Restoration era, the middle of the 17th century. It was quite a different type of building. And they were buildings that were meant to be genteel, picturesque, comfortable, had in some cases even a sense of retiral about them. Horace Field tried to design gardens for them. One imagines the squire sitting in the garden with his pipe and his ale, perhaps. These were all qualities that were actually very highly valued in architecture until the Gothic Revival came about. All those things, the picturesqueness, the prettiness, the gentleness, the sense of retiral, these were clobbered by the Gothic Revival, which found them to be evil and needed to be destroyed, essentially, to use the kind of language that they would be using. And yet people liked them. And because people liked them, these bank branches that Field and his many imitators designed began to spread right across the country. In fact, in many high streets, you can see not one, but probably 3 or 4 bank branches in that style, continued right up to the 1930s. And very soon afterwards, the post offices followed, and then other shops, the tea rooms, perhaps anything with a pretense to gentility, the milliners, the haberdashers and so on, began to copy it. These are buildings that people see and pass every day, and by and large they're not protected because they're not important. They're not, as it were, good. Their windows might easily get wrecked and replaced by plastic ones because nobody's looking out for them, as it were. But they're buildings, it seems to me, that tell a much more complicated story than the simple good and bad. And sometimes I think that it's the novelists and the poets who have got it right. Because when they refer to a building, first of all, they may not do so very accurately, and they may not be telling a truth, as it were, about that building, an objective fact about it. Some do, some don't. It's a matter of style and approach, as personality, I suppose. But what they are trying to do is to convey something bigger than simply a kind of technical description of the object as being a successful one or not. In fact, it's the great multiplicity of different voices about buildings that starts to build up a much more interesting story about what they are for. It seems to me possible that you can tell the story of a single building in a number of different ways, in the ways in which it appeals, for example, to different types of people, if you want to arrive at a much more accurate description of its importance than the old-fashioned good and bad, success or failure. I had a few years back a third-year student called Adam Summerfield, and he was writing his dissertation about the kind of language that architects use. And he gave me a very interesting example, which I've thought about many times since. Adam came from the Medway towns in North Kent, and he wrote about an occurrence that had taken place in Chatham, where the architects, and they were well-known international stars in the world of architecture, had made a sophisticated proposal for the redevelopment of the riverfront in Chatham. They went into an exhibition to show the general public what they were doing, with the last word in sophisticated computer graphics, in perspectives and elevations and all the rest of it. And they were very surprised to find that the people who lived in the town were completely appalled by it. They didn't really understand it. The drawings, which for architects are very simple to get the point of, meant nothing to most people who don't see them in the same way. And the point that Adam made was that what the architects could much better have done was to have made those buildings into a story, to say what they felt that the place would become in words and maybe in suggestions of their appearance, rather than giving them those straight lines and those accurate perspectives. Because stories are things that many more people will latch onto and relate to than this normal line of architectural criticism. So what I'd say in conclusion is that what I suggest is that you look at buildings in more than one way. It's not necessarily a matter of what it's made of. It's not necessarily a matter of early Victorian arguments about the purity of construction. It certainly isn't a matter of morality. It's about what buildings mean to people in different ways, whether they're the architects, whether they're those who pass it by, whether they're people who glimpse it once, whether they're people who pass it on holiday, or whether they're people who know those buildings inside out because every day they're doing it. And once you begin to put together those stories and to construct a great crowd of voices that talk about the relative importance in different ways and for different reasons, then you start to construct a form of architectural criticism which is much closer to what it is that the buildings can offer with all the richness of their construction. Thank you very much for listening to me.